Michele Yo and welcome to the second edition of the 2017 Quiltmania Mystery Quilt. This month we're doing the two blocks that are positioned on the table, so two applique blocks. Both of them have a little bit of reverse applique, this one in here and this second one through the middle of the leaves there. If preferred, you can top applique that if that's your preference. The fabrics that we're using this month are just demonstrated here. So we're going to be introducing a few new fabrics. We've got the Torrington, blue Torrington circle, the red lattice print, the paisley prints that we haven't used previously, and the yellow shirting. Okay, so we'll get started and I'll show you just some of the tips in the techniques to make these two blocks. One thing I did forget to mention was when you're setting up your star here, this block is actually in the finished quilt going to sit on point. So we're going to have it sitting that way. So for me, I wanted this lattice print to be sitting on an angle rather than in squares going down. So what that meant was that when I positioned it on the block as it is square, I wanted these lines to be straight as opposed to being on the diagonal. So it's straight sitting here. Once we've appliqued it and we then turn it sitting on point, those lattices will be across. So just something to bear in mind when you're positioning it. If you prefer that look as opposed to the straight look, you just have to be conscious of setting it up so that when it's sitting on point, it's sitting the way that you're wanting it to be presented. So we're going to start off with the 18-inch block that we started off with last time. So the same background square. This enables us to work our applique and then to actually cut it down so that if there's any movement or anything, you still end up with the correct size block at the end. So with this, I've pre-cut this, and what I like to do is I've done this on the ironing board, just go to the ironing board and just fold it in half to get your, and then fold it in half again to get your quarters. And then do the same thing across the diagonal so that we've also got your diagonal reference points as well. This just helps us to center the block properly and make sure that everything is centered, especially if we've got any sort of 8-pointed stars or any sort of points that we want correctly positioned. So I'll just pop that aside. That's ready for another block. So you'll see here we've done, again I folded it so that we've actually got that diagonal fold and we've got also the fold across the center. So you can see how much easier it is to then position this, finding the center point with this one, putting it in the center and lining everything up. So we're starting off, when I applique this, I actually started off putting down the leaves first and appliquing those leaves on. And from there I was able to put the star on. And then once I had appliqued the star down, we can then put the hearts on. And you can see that I haven't quite finished this because I thought I'd leave a little bit just to demonstrate the technique. Okay, now I like to actually baste my shapes down. I just find that it's much easier if it's basted down. It's not going to move on you as you work as easily. So I've already sewn these three down and I've sewn the majority of this, but I just left a little bit just to show you the points and the curves, which we did cover last time, but just as a different, slightly different technique doing it from above. I just thought I'd run through it again. So just to show you, I've come around here and we've got quite a point, an inward point coming down the bottom here. So just make sure that you don't have an excess in seam allowance, and I like to have about 3/16 of an inch. If you have the full 1/4 inch, you'll find that it actually is too much and you won't get a smooth curve. You'll tend to get sort of a jagged pointy curve. So just moving in, flicking under with your needle and just working your way down towards that point. Now I've matched my thread to the blue fabric here, and I just have a preference for using Orifil thread, but everybody has their own choice of thread. I just find that that's a nice thread that doesn't tangle too much, and I find it doesn't split too much either. So working your way down, Now as you get down towards the point, you'll actually need to cut in, oops, hopefully you don't cut the cord on your pin cushion. And just keeping your thread out the way so you don't cut in. I just cut into that point to within a couple of threads of the actual point. So we're working down, we've cut in a little bit just to carefully turn it under, and just being aware that because we've cut in, we don't want it to fray. So that's why we don't cut that too early. If you cut it too early, you risk it fraying away as you're working and handling it. So don't cut down until you really need to. So we've got quite close here to this point. I'm going to go in and working down towards it. You'll see that I'm not quite on the point in terms of the cut line, but I'm going to put my needle in between the two layers and bring it out right on the point. And then I'm going to again between the two layers. If we need to, we can trim just another little snip, but we just don't want to get ourselves in a situation where you can't get rid of all those raw edges because you've cut too far. So again, right on the point and pulling that in tightly so that you're pulling those edges in. Then we can turn our work, and you'll start to needle turn up a little bit, up with the head of your needle to flick that work under and pull it back so that you're getting rid of all those raw edges. Just like that. So those raw edges are now all inside the seam allowance. You'll then take another stitch through all the layers as opposed to just the top and proceed up the edge of the leaf. Now this has got a slight curve where we are now and a more marked curve up further, and because we've only got a 3/16 of a seam allowance, you'll find that you shouldn't need to cut anything else away, and you shouldn't need to clip in to your seams. So you can turn quite a bit and just hold it with your thumb as you're going around a curve like this so that you can make sure that it's nice and smooth. And holding it firmly, you can then just tweak as you need to, just to make sure that it's nice and smooth and that all the lines are hidden in the seam allowance. Okay, so we've now completed the 4 leaves, and I'm just going to remove the basting thread. You don't need that any longer. And then we're going to work on the actual star. We'd start off with just doing the 4 leaves. I've actually started this star because I didn't want you to sit here while I applicate the whole thing on. You can see it's all basted, and I've done all but this last bit just so that I can show you the points. So centered, the star centered on, just trying to line up so that these points are centered within the end tips of the leaves. So again, we've got another inward point, so I'm just going to reinforce that that's exactly the same as we've done. You'll see I've got a little bit more seam allowance here than the 3/16 of an inch, so we'll just trim that back, trimming it down to the point and just removing that. So I haven't actually, I wouldn't normally clip in to that point until we are a fair way down. So I've sewn down from the top here, so at this point we can clip in towards that inward point. Again, turning our work in. Just make sure when you baste your shape on that you do keep your stitches back from the edge enough so that you've got allowed enough room for your seam allowance to turn under. You don't want your seam allowance to bunch up. It's because you've got your basting stitching too close to it and it can't sort of sit flat. So now we've now got the star on. I've sewn 3 of the hearts on. So the last thing to do before we put the middle part of this block in is just to position this heart. And again, just referring back, we ironed the folds in at the start, and it just means that it makes it easier for us, that we don't have to keep going back to the light box. I prefer not to mark all my background fabrics because chances are when you're working it, the lines will never match up for some reason, and you don't want pencil marks on your background. So if you've just given yourself those reference points in folds, you can then easily position things. So just putting a pin through the point there, lining that up with the point that we've got here of our star, and just ironing that on, just making sure that that's sitting along the fold here, and that's enough to keep it nice and straight. Okay, so we've now completed the block to the point where we've got the central star on, all the leaves and the heart. We're now going to set up for the next part of the block, so for the center part of the block. So I've just got an old light box here, and we're going to center the block over the top of the light box so that we line up the star points and the hearts, and we can then see through that and draw on the design underneath. Now, the option of doing this is we can actually reverse applique this section, this center part, or we can top applique it from the top. Now, either way, if you prefer, you could actually transfer this design onto the star before you piece it on, before you applique it on, if you'd prefer to do it that way, and if you feel you can see it better. So once you've done that, we're going to position this over the top, just lining it all up. Now, my preference when I applique is to actually use a non-iron interfacing, fairly thick, but I find that to make templates with that, I can cut my curves fairly smoothly, rather as opposed to Templastic and freezer paper. I just find it a little bit easier. You could make this template alternatively out of freezer paper if you prefer, and iron it on. So the other thing with this is it does adhere a little bit, so it doesn't tend to slip and slide as much as some things. So lining this up with the design underneath, we can then transfer the design onto the lattice print. Now, if you were going to top applique this from the top, you can already have this piece of fabric cut and with this added little seam allowance, and you can position it line for line for piecing or for appliquing it on. I'm going to reverse applique this, and so I'm going to transfer my line onto the lattice print underneath, and then I'm going to carefully cut that away. So positioning that carefully, you can line it up underneath. Just find your centers. You can again mark your centers in it so that you know that you're lining everything up accurately. So you'll go ahead and mark that on. Now, once you've done that, we're ready to cut away the excess lattice so that we're going to reveal the shirting underneath. Okay, so we've marked the lines on. I'm not sure whether you can see that. What I'm going to do is now lift that up and pull the background and the lattice apart so that we've got no risk of cutting through on the background. And just to find my line is here, and we're just going to put a little snip in there so that we can get the scissors inside to cut away. So I'm just making sure that I'm not in the wrong spot. And then scissors in and just going about 3/16 of an inch from that line. Now, so as I said earlier, you can applique this from the top if you want, and that would be just using the same technique that we referred to earlier. Obviously that's going to be a little bit more bulky than cutting this away, and we're going to then do another applique over the top of this. So just by cutting this and doing it reverse applique, you've just got one layer underneath with the applique. If you applique on this and then on that again, you end up with 4 layers. So it's just something to think about. Okay, and and then we can take that right off. So we've now only got that one layer underneath. Now, we've got a few options here. This is actually anchored down because we've stitched it down. So we can see how we go in terms of whether you feel you need to anchor it a little bit more. If you do, you can put a couple of pins in, or you can again baste around here, keeping it far enough away that you've got enough room for your seam allowance. Now, because we're appliquing in effect the red down, we're going to use a red thread. And then we can start to stitch that down. The centre's now completed, and I've given it a quick press, so if you flip it over and press it from the back, just so that it's nice and flat before you do the next bit. Now we're going to cut from the paisley print, so this particular print here, just one of these motifs to sit in the centre here, just to make a feature of it. So I've pre-cut one, and I'm going to get the light box and just position it over the light box using the pattern piece. So we'll set that up and we'll pin that on. Now, as you'll see, that's one of the other benefits of reverse appliquing that centre part, because it's very clear and easy to see through the pattern. Now, there's no reason why you can't position this wherever you'd like to position it. You don't have to position it in the same place that I have, just as long as you position it so that it's quite aesthetically placed and pleasing to your eye. You'll see that I've just cut this from the paisley, as I mentioned, and we've just allowed a slight seam allowance. You again will cut that away as we applique it on. If you prefer, you can buttonhole applique this, in which case you would iron a piece of fusible webbing onto the back of the paisley and cut the fabric out with the webbing off on the back of it, and then you'll peel the paper off, position it on here, and using an applique mat iron it in place, and then using whatever thread that you choose to use, you can buttonhole applique around the outside of it. If I'm doing that, I prefer to use the quilting weight of Oroville thread. That's the number 28. I just like the look of that, but it depends on what sort of feature you're wanting with your stitching, whether you're wanting that stitching to show out and be a feature, or whether you're wanting it to just to subside into the background. For this sample, I'm going to needle turn applique it. So I've positioned it in place. I'm just going to pop a couple of pins in there to hold it, and then I will once again baste it on. And then using the applique technique that we've previously shown, that I've previously shown you, for all the curves and all the points, both inner and outer, we'll applique that in place. So as we go down, I will stitch around here, and I will cut in here so that I can remove more of that red background fabric. In here, depending on how confident you are, you can just leave a rim around there if you'd prefer. It'll be hard to get right in probably and do all of these little baubles individually, but you may want to just remove that section of red in the middle just for effect. So really it's up to you how much you would prefer to remove and how much you'd prefer to remain. Obviously if you buttonhole it, you'll be able to remove all of the red background. When you're needle turning, you may have difficulty getting into these finer points. So it's really a personal preference. So once you've pinned that on, just baste it on so that it's nice and firm, and then you can begin your applique. Just needle turning back to the line so that you're getting that more distinction with the shape of that flower there. Okay, so as you can see, we've now completed the applique on this, the broderie purse. I've gone in and cut away this little bit of red in here and gone in here. Here I've just left that because it's too intricate to get into. If you prefer, you could cut those little bits away if you feel that it's too difficult to get in between, if you're looking at getting it really neat. So really up to you as to how much you put in here and how much you cut away. So that's that block completed. You would then turn it over and iron it from the back, and the finished block will be trimmed down. It will be 15.5 inches including seam allowances. So the finished block is 15 inches, so 15.5 with seam allowances. This block here is the second block we're doing this month. So it's an applique block, again appliqued from the top with a little bit of reverse applique through the middle here. I'm not going to demonstrate how to actually applique this block because we've covered that in the previous video. The way you set it out is this is actually appliqued in one piece, this blue Torrington circle fabric with the blue Torrington circle fabric. Again, going in with your curves like we previously discussed, so clipping away at the inner curves as you need to, just so that you can get it nice and smooth. Again, make sure that you haven't got too much seam allowance, about 3/16 of an inch should be enough. Once you've appliqued the blue section on, you can then applique the yellow shirtings down, and that includes this little shirting here. So you'll have to place it over the light box as previously, making sure that you fold your fabrics like we did last time so that you've got those diagonal reference points that you're going to lay this across. With the light box, you'll pin these yellow shirtings down, applique those on, and then go back to the light box to position the red hoods. Once you've appliqued this blue leaf on, mark the position of this cutaway section in here, and just with a basting thread, just baste around, giving yourself enough room around the edge of that so that you're not going to hit the basting when you applique, and then gently easing the two fabrics apart so that you get that top layer away from the background. Put the scissors in and just gently or carefully do one single slash line through the middle of there. You can then reverse applique that down to the line that you've drawn, being careful at the ends because there's a slight curve there, so just making sure that you don't trim that back too far. And if you would prefer not to reverse applique, you could applique that shape from the top just using your shirting background fabric. Once the block is complete, press it from the back again so that you've got it nice and flat, and then trim it the whole block back to 15.5 inches including seam allowances, as the finished block is 15 inches. So that completes this month's videos for the two blocks that we're doing. I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you've learned something by it, and I'll see you next month. Happy sewing!